The sharp, dismissive words cut through the cheerful haze of the 4th of July barbecue. A scalpel of contempt in a symphony of celebration. "You're not welcome here, Dad. I only invited Robert." Mark's voice was low, tight with a mixture of embarrassment and cruelty, each word a carefully aimed stone. His father, Arthur, stood on the edge of the manicured lawn, a ghost at the feast. He wore simple khaki pants and a faded blue polo shirt, his posture stoic, his face a roadmap of years he never spoke of. He clutched a small, clumsily wrapped gift in his hand, a bottle of something inexpensive, a token from a world his son had long since left behind. To Mark, to his polished friends sipping craft beer by the shimmering pool, to his successful father-in-law, Robert, holding court by the stainless steel grill, Arthur was an anomaly. He was a relic, a failure, a man whose life had amounted to a small, dusty apartment and a limp that grew more pronounced with each passing year. They saw his worn-out shoes, his calloused hands, the quiet way he held himself as if trying to take up less space in the world. They saw weakness, but what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that the quiet old man standing before them had once been a titan, a whisper in the high places of global conflict, a man whose shadow had fallen across battlefields that weren't printed on any map. They didn't know that the faint, almost invisible scar above his right eye was not from a fall, but from the shrapnel of a grenade in a forgotten jungle. They didn't know that the limp was not a sign of age, but a permanent reminder of a fall from a helicopter into the freezing waters of a northern sea to save a man he barely knew. They saw a janitor, a handyman, a ghost of a man. They had no idea they were looking at a legend. Welcome back to our channel, where we believe that the greatest stories of heroism are often hidden in the quietest lives. Before we dive into Arthur's incredible journey of vindication, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story that reminds us to look beyond the surface. Today's story is a powerful reminder that honor doesn't need an audience, and courage is often forged in the silence that others mistake for absence. The scene was a perfect picture of suburban success. The lawn was a carpet of impossible green, the air thick with the smell of expensive charcoal and sizzling steak. Laughter, light and untroubled, tinkled like wind chimes. Mark, Arthur's son, had built this life brick by shiny brick. He was a vice president at a tech firm, his wife, Sarah, was a beautiful and kind woman, and his father-in-law, Robert, was the sun around which this entire solar system of success revolved. Robert was a real estate mogul, a man who spoke in terms of acquisitions and portfolios, his voice a booming instrument of self-satisfaction. He was everything Arthur was not: loud, ostentatious, and dripping with the kind of confidence that only comes from a life devoid of any real, existential threat. Arthur's arrival was an uninvited disruption, a crack in the flawless facade. He had come because it was the 4th of July, because he had hoped to see his grandson, Leo, and because a small, stubborn part of him still believed in the bonds of family. But as he stood there, watching his son's face twist into a mask of shame, he felt the familiar weight of a world that had no place for him. He said nothing. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply stood, his presence a silent question in the midst of all the certainty. The gift in his hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy, a fool's offering at the altar of a god that had long ago rejected him. The silence stretched, pregnant with 1,000 unspoken disappointments, a history of drifting apart that had now culminated in this brutal, final severance on a day meant to celebrate unity. Arthur's life was a study in minimalism, a quiet testament to a man who had learned to live with less. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a walk-up building that smelled perpetually of dust and boiled cabbage. It contained a bed, neatly made with military precision, a small table with one chair, a worn armchair facing a window that looked out onto a brick wall, and a handful of books on history and mechanics. There were no photographs, no mementos, no clutter. It was the space of a man passing through, even though he had lived there for over a decade. His days were structured by a discipline that had been forged in a crucible most men couldn't even imagine. He rose before the sun, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He would do a series of stretches, his movements slow and deliberate, working through the permanent ache in his left leg. He would make coffee, black, and drink it standing by the window, watching the city slowly come to life. He worked as a night janitor at a downtown office building, a job he'd held for years. He liked the silence, the solitude. He found a certain peace in the rhythmic swish of a mop, the hum of a floor buffer, the simple act of bringing order to the chaos left behind by others. His coworkers saw him as a nice old man, quiet, dependable. They knew nothing of the man he used to be. They couldn't know that the same hands that now wiped down conference tables had once disarmed complex, explosive devices under the deafening thunder of mortar fire. They didn't know that the eyes that now looked for smudges on glass had once scanned desert horizons for the glint of a sniper's scope. Arthur carried his past not as a burden, but as a part of his own internal landscape. It was a silent country inside him, a place he visited in the deep hours of the night when the world was asleep. He never spoke of it. Not to his son, not to anyone. It was a locked room, and he had long ago swallowed the key. There was, however, one small, almost imperceptible keyhole. On the inside of his left wrist, usually hidden by the simple, practical watch he always wore, was a tattoo. It was so faded it was barely a ghost of ink on his weathered skin. It wasn't a skull or an anchor or any of the common military designs. It was a strange, elegant sigil, a stylized falcon with a lightning bolt clutched in its talons. It was the insignia of a unit so clandestine its existence was officially denied, a unit known only to a select few in the highest echelons of command. It was a symbol of a brotherhood forged in secrets and sacrifice. Sometimes, late at night, he would take off his watch and trace the faded lines with his finger. He wouldn't feel pride, or regret, or even nostalgia. He would just feel a profound, silent acknowledgement of the man he was, the things he had done, and the promises he had kept. His son, Mark, would have never seen it. Mark hadn't been close enough to his father to notice such a detail in 20 years. And even if he had, he would not have understood its meaning. To him, it would have just been another strange mark on a man he no longer knew, another piece of a past he had no interest in excavating. Sarah, Mark's wife, was the only one who sensed the depth. She saw the way Arthur moved, the economy of his motion. She saw the stillness in his eyes, a calm that was not empty but full, as if he were watching the world from a great, unassailable height. She felt an unspoken power in his silence, a dignity that made her husband's loud pronouncements and her father's booming laughter seem hollow and insecure. She often tried to talk to him at the rare family gatherings he was permitted to attend, but his answers were always short, polite, and impenetrable. He was a fortress, and she did not have the code. Mark's world was built on the foundation of his father-in-law's approval. Robert was the platonic ideal of success in Mark's eyes, a man who had bent the world to his will through sheer force of personality and shrewd business acumen. Robert's house was a palace of glass and steel overlooking a golf course. His cars were German, his suits were Italian, and his opinions were delivered as inarguable facts. He was a man who measured worth in square footage and stock options. He saw Arthur as the embodiment of everything he despised: stagnation, poverty, and a stubborn refusal to play the game. In Robert's worldview, a man's value was directly proportional to his net worth. Arthur's balance sheet was, in his estimation, zero. "Your father is a good man, I'm sure," Robert would say to Mark, a patronizing smile playing on his lips. "But he lacks ambition. He never understood how the world works. Not the real world, anyway." This narrative had been drilled into Mark for years, a slow-acting poison that had eroded any lingering respect he might have had for his own father. Mark came to see Arthur through Robert's eyes, as a source of second-hand embarrassment, a living reminder of a more humble origin he was desperate to forget. The 4th of July party was the ultimate stage for Robert's particular brand of performative patriotism. He loved to talk about this great country and the opportunities it afforded men like him. He'd made a sizable donation to a veterans charity that year, and he made sure everyone at the party knew it. He spoke of the donation not as an act of altruism, but as another one of his savvy investments, this time in social capital. "It's important to support our troops," he'd boom, gesturing with a cigar. "They do the dirty work so men like us can build the country." The irony of his statement was lost on him and on most of his audience. They nodded in agreement, impressed by his largesse. To them, supporting the troops meant writing a check, putting a yellow ribbon magnet on the back of a luxury SUV. It was an abstract concept, a transaction. They had no framework to understand the reality of service, the cost that was paid not in dollars, but in blood, in youth, in pieces of one's soul. This was the environment Arthur had walked into. It was a world of surfaces, of polished exteriors and hollow interiors. Mark, desperate to cement his place in this world, saw his father's presence as a direct threat to his carefully constructed identity. Arthur's faded polo shirt was a stain on the designer landscape. His silence was a reproach to the endless, self-congratulatory chatter. His very existence was a reminder that another kind of man, another kind of life was possible, and this was an idea that Mark and Robert could not tolerate. Their own identities were too fragile, built on a scaffolding of money and status that would collapse if confronted with something as real and solid as Arthur's quiet, unadorned dignity. So they had to dismiss him, to mock him, to make him small so that they could continue to feel big. Their contempt was not just cruelty. It was a defense mechanism, a wall they built around their own hollowness. They judged him by his humble appearance because it was the only metric they understood, the only language they spoke. And in their arrogant ignorance, they committed the gravest sin. They mistook humility for weakness and silence for surrender. Arthur stood in the corner of the immaculate patio, a ship moored in a forgotten harbor. He had not moved after Mark's brutal dismissal. He had simply given a small, almost imperceptible nod and retreated to the periphery, a silent observer of his son's triumphant life. The gift, the bottle of whiskey he'd bought with what little disposable income he had, now sat on a small side table, looking cheap and out of place next to a silver bucket of iced champagne. The inciting incident, the public dismissal, had already happened, but the humiliation was a slow, creeping tide. Robert, full of stake and self-importance, approached Mark, clapping him on the shoulder. "Mark, my boy, great party. A little later, I want to tell everyone about the new downtown merger. A real coup. We're changing the skyline." He then glanced over at Arthur, a smirk playing on his lips. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, loud enough for several nearby guests to hear. "What's your father still doing here? I thought this was a private celebration." Mark's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "He just showed up, Robert. I've handled it. He's leaving soon." The words were a fresh wound. Arthur heard them, of course. His hearing, honed by years of listening for the snap of a twig in a silent jungle, was still sharp. He didn't flinch. He just watched a bee investigate a blooming hydrangea, his focus absolute, his face a granite mask. The guests, friends of Mark and Robert, took their cues from their hosts. They cast pitying or disdainful glances toward the old man in the corner. They saw him as Mark and Robert did, a sad, slightly pathetic figure who didn't know his place. They shifted their bodies, subtly turning their backs to him, creating a social cordon sanitaire, isolating him completely. He was there, but he was not. The rising action began to build, a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of disrespect. Sarah, Mark's wife, saw it all. Her heart ached for Arthur. She brought him a glass of water. "Arthur," she said, her voice soft, "I'm so glad you came. Leo was asking about you." Arthur's eyes met hers for a moment, and in them she saw not anger or self-pity, but a deep, oceanic sadness. "He's a good boy," Arthur said. That was all. Just 4 words, but they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken feelings. He accepted the water with a quiet, "Thank you, Sarah." He was a man dying of thirst who was too polite to ask for a drink. The public challenge was yet to come. Robert, feeling magnanimous after another glass of expensive wine, decided it was time for a speech. He gathered everyone around the pool, a self-appointed master of ceremonies. He spoke of freedom, of liberty, of the American dream, his American dream. He was the hero of his own story, a captain of industry, a pillar of the community. He was everything a man should be, The disrespect was a rising crescendo, each note sharper and more discordant than the last. Robert, standing poolside with the setting sun glinting off his gold watch, launched into his grand oration. On this day, he began, his voice resonating with manufactured gravitas. We celebrate the birth of this great nation, a nation built by men of vision and drive. Men who weren't afraid to take risks, to build something from nothing. He paused, letting his words hang in the air, his gaze sweeping over his audience of acolytes. He was not talking about the founding fathers. He was talking about himself. He then moved to his favorite topic, his own brand of patriotism. And we must never forget to support the brave men and women in uniform, he declared, raising his glass. That's why this year, my company made a record-breaking donation to the Veterans Support Fund. A 7-figure donation. A polite, impressed applause rippled through the crowd. Mark beamed, his chest puffed with borrowed pride. Robert let the applause die down before delivering his coup de grace. He looked vaguely in Arthur's direction, a sly, condescending smile on his face. Of course, we have to support them because it's a tough transition back to the real world. Not everyone is cut out for the pressures of the modern marketplace. Some guys just get stuck in the past. They have their service, and we thank them for it, but they can't quite make it afterward. The insult was as sharp as it was cowardly, a veiled attack designed to humiliate Arthur without giving him grounds to respond. It landed with brutal precision. The guests murmured in agreement, nodding at the perceived wisdom of Robert's statement. They saw Arthur, silent in the corner, and saw Robert's point made manifest. They saw a man who had gotten stuck. Sarah, standing near the back of the crowd, felt a surge of hot anger. She looked at her father, then at her husband, and felt a profound sense of shame. Her gaze then fell on Arthur. He hadn't moved. His face was unreadable. But as he shifted his weight, his sleeve, still slightly damp from the water glass she'd given him, slid down just a fraction of an inch. For the first time, she saw it. Beneath the band of his old watch on the pale skin of his wrist was a tattoo. It was so faded it was almost a watermark, a whisper of old ink. It was a bird, a hawk or a falcon. Its wings spread wide, and in its talons it held a jagged shape, a lightning bolt. It was a strange, powerful symbol, unlike any tattoo she had ever seen. It didn't look like a memento. It looked like a brand, a mark of ownership. An open loop formed in her mind, a question that suddenly overshadowed everything else. Who was this man? The observer had seen the totem. The mystery deepened, even as the humiliation intensified. The narrative had shifted, a subtle, tectonic movement that only she and the audience could feel. The arrogant foils continued their performance, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath their feet was about to give way. The stage was being set for a reveal they could not possibly imagine. The final act of desecration was not directed at Arthur himself, but at his legacy, at the one pure thing he had left in this world, the love of his grandson. Leo, Mark and Sarah's 7-year-old son, had grown bored of the adult conversation. He had his grandfather's eyes, quiet and observant. He had always been drawn to Arthur's stillness. While Grandpa Robert was loud and smelled of cigars, Grandpa Arthur was calm. He was a quiet island in a noisy sea. Leo slipped away from his mother's side and made his way over to the corner where Arthur stood. "Grandpa," he said, his small voice cutting through the smug ambience. Arthur's stony expression softened instantly as he looked down at the boy. A genuine, small smile touched his lips. "Hey there, Captain," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. Leo pointed to a small, intricate knot Arthur had tied in a piece of loose twine he'd found, something to keep his hands busy. "Can you teach me to tie that knot?" Leo asked. Arthur knelt down, his bad leg protesting with a dull ache. "Of course," he said. "This is a bowline. It's a good knot. It never slips." He began to show the boy, his large, calloused hands moving with surprising dexterity, guiding Leo's small fingers. It was a simple, beautiful moment of connection, a grandfather passing on a small piece of practical wisdom to his grandson. A bridge was being built across the generational chasm, a quiet act of love and legacy. But the moment was shattered. Robert saw it first. "Mark," he said, his voice dripping with disapproval, "you might want to get your son. Who knows what kind of nonsense your father is filling his head with. The boy needs to be around real role models, men of substance." The words were a command. Humiliated, his face burning with a shame that was entirely his own creation, Mark strode across the patio. He didn't speak to his father. He grabbed Leo's arm a little too roughly. "Leo, come on. Let's go listen to Grandpa Robert talk about the new building. That's interesting stuff. That's the real world." Leo looked confused, his face crumbling. "But I want to stay with Grandpa Arthur. He's teaching me knots." "That's enough," Mark snapped. "Come on. Now." He pulled the boy away, leaving Arthur kneeling on the cold stone pavers, his hands frozen in the act of teaching. The piece of twine fell to the ground. Arthur slowly, painfully, pushed himself back to his feet. He looked across the patio at his son, who was now forcing a smile, positioning his own child at the feet of a man of substance. He saw his grandson look back at him, his eyes wide with confusion and hurt. This was the final, deepest cut. It wasn't just about him anymore. Mark had denied his own son a connection to his past, to his own blood. He had chosen the hollow gleam of materialism over the quiet gold of heritage. Arthur's face was a mask of stone, but behind his eyes, a fortress that had withstood decades of war and loss finally began to show a crack. A profound, silent grief washed over him. He had lost his son long ago, but in that moment he felt he had lost his grandson too. The party continued, but for Arthur, the world had gone silent. Just as the last light of the setting sun bled from the sky, a new sound intruded upon the party's self-congratulatory hum. It was a low, powerful thrum, the sound of an engine that was not designed for civilian use. A pair of headlights cut through the twilight at the end of the long, curved driveway. A vehicle, a large, black, unmarked SUV with tinted windows, pulled to a silent stop in front of the house. It was the kind of vehicle that belonged to no one and everyone, a specter of government authority. The music from the poolside speakers seemed to falter, the cheerful pop songs suddenly sounding tinny and inappropriate. A palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere. Laughter died in throats. Conversations trailed off into confused silence. Every head turned towards the silent, imposing vehicle. The driver's side door opened, and a man in a crisp, dark suit stepped out. He moved with the coiled energy of a predator. Then, the rear doors opened in unison. From one side stepped a man who could only be a four-star general. His dress uniform was a constellation of medals and ribbons, a testament to a life lived at the highest levels of command. His posture was ramrod straight, his face severe, a mask of authority. From the other side stepped two other men, younger, but no less imposing. They were not in dress uniforms but in perfectly tailored dark suits, their lapels bearing a single, small, discreet pin, the same falcon and lightning bolt that was tattooed on Arthur's wrist. They were operators, their bodies honed into weapons, their eyes constantly scanning, assessing, missing nothing. They moved as a single unit, their polished black boots hitting the asphalt with a synchronized, rhythmic impact that sounded like a judgment. The entire party was frozen, a tableau of suburban shock. These men did not belong here. They were from a different world, a world of consequence and gravity that made the concerns of mergers and golf scores seem like a child's game. They ignored the gawking guests. They ignored Robert, who stood with his mouth slightly agape, his cigar forgotten in his hand. They ignored Mark, who started to walk forward, a nervous host smile plastered on his face, ready to ask if he could help them. The general silenced him with a glance, a look so cold and commanding that Mark froze in his tracks, his smile dissolving. The three men's eyes scanned the crowd, their gaze sweeping past the faces of the wealthy and the successful, dismissing them as irrelevant scenery. Then their eyes found him. They locked onto the quiet old man in the faded polo shirt, standing alone in the corner. The general's severe expression softened, replaced by something else entirely, a look of profound, undiluted respect, a look of reverence. He began to walk forward, his two companions falling into perfect step behind him, their destination clear and absolute. They were crossing a chasm, not just of a manicured lawn, but of two different universes. And they were coming for Arthur. The general strode across the patio, his path parting the stunned crowd like a ship through water. He walked directly to the corner where Arthur stood, his two silent companions flanking him like sentinels. The air crackled with a tension that was thicker than the evening humidity. Robert's arrogant bluster had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. Mark was pale, a dawning, terrifying realization flickering in his eyes. The general stopped a foot in front of Arthur. For a moment, the two men just looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them that spanned decades and continents. Then, the four-star general, a man who commanded armies, a man who advised presidents, did something that shattered the reality of everyone present. He snapped to attention, his back rigid, his movement a razor-sharp display of military perfection. He raised his right hand in a salute. It was not a casual gesture. It was a salute of profound deference, of honor, a student saluting a master. The silence on the patio became absolute, a physical weight pressing down on everyone. Arthur, his face still a mask of quiet dignity, gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, a king accepting the fealty of his most trusted knight. Then, the general lowered his hand and turned to face the stunned, silent crowd. His eyes, cold and hard as chips of flint, swept over them, lingering for a beat on Mark and then on Robert, a look of undisguised contempt on his face. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried an authority that cut through the silence like a blade. "You people have no idea who you're standing with," he began, his voice low and dangerous. "You see an old man. You see a janitor. You see a failure." He paused, letting the shame of his words settle on his audience. "I see a hero. I see a giant. I see the man who saved my life and the lives of 12 others in the Kandahar Valley with nothing but a knife and a length of wire." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Sarah brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and dawning understanding. "This man," the general continued, his voice rising in a reverent crescendo, his finger jabbing in Arthur's direction, "is not just a veteran. He is Chief Warrant Officer Arthur Jensen, retired. Though men like him are never truly retired. You know him as Arthur. We knew him by another name. We called him Ghost." The name hung in the air, mythical and terrifying. "His unit's existence is classified. Their missions are the things that keep you safe at night, the silent, bloody work that allows you to have parties like this and boast about your stock portfolios." He took a step forward, his gaze locking onto Robert. "You talk about sacrifice? This man's body is a roadmap of sacrifice. The limp he walks with, that's from a 500-foot fall into the Barents Sea after ensuring his entire team got out of a dying helicopter. The scar on his head, that's from a piece of shrapnel he took while shielding a wounded comrade from a mortar blast. He has 2 distinguished service crosses, 4 silver stars, 6 purple hearts, medals he keeps in a shoebox because he believes honor is something you live, not something you display." The general turned his piercing gaze on Mark. "You, his son, you stand here, ashamed of him? You should be on your knees. This man gave up everything, a normal life, a family, peace of mind, so that you could have the luxury of being embarrassed by him. He missed your birthdays, your graduations, your wedding, not because he didn't care, but because he was in some godforsaken hellhole, ensuring that the world your children would grow up in was a little bit safer. He has stood on the wall against the darkness your entire life, and you don't even have the decency to thank him." He turned back to Arthur, his voice softening with emotion. "It's time to go, Ghost. The president is awarding the unit a citation. He asked for you personally. The boys are waiting." The general's final words fell into a silence so profound it felt like the aftermath of an explosion. The world had been rearranged. The power dynamic, once so firmly tilted towards the wealth and arrogance of Robert and Mark, had been completely inverted. They were now the small ones, the insignificant ones, exposed in the harsh, clarifying light of true honor. The camera of the mind would pan across the faces. Robert's face was a ruin, his self-satisfaction and arrogance stripped away, leaving behind the pale, doughy face of a man who had just seen a god and realized he was an insect. His cigar had fallen from his nerveless fingers and lay extinguished on the pristine patio stones. Mark was worse. His face was a canvas of shock, shame, and a dawning, horrified grief. It was the face of a man who had just realized he had committed an unforgivable sin, that he had thrown away a priceless treasure he never even knew he possessed. He looked at his father, truly looked at him for the first time in his adult life, and saw not the quiet, failed old man, but the giant the general had described. He saw the hero, and he saw the immense, unbridgeable chasm his own cruelty had carved between them. The other guests, the sycophants and friends, could not meet anyone's eyes. They stared at their shoes, at the pool, at anything but the man they had scorned just moments before. Their pity and disdain had curdled into a thick, choking shame. Sarah was weeping silently, tears of shock, of pride, of a terrible, aching sadness for what her husband had done. The general placed a gentle hand on Arthur's shoulder. "They're waiting for us, Arthur." Arthur looked at the general, then his gaze moved past him to his son. He looked at Mark, and in his eyes, there was no triumph, no "I told you so." There was only a vast, deep, and weary sadness. A father's grief for a son he had lost not to war, but to the hollow comforts of peace. He offered no words of forgiveness or condemnation. He offered nothing. His silence was more powerful than any speech. It was the silence of a mountain, unmoved by the fleeting storms that raged at its base. He turned away from his son, from the ruins of the party, from the life he could never be a part of. He gave a small nod to the general. "All right, John," he said, his voice quiet, steady. "Let's go." He walked with the general and his two silent companions towards the waiting SUV. He didn't look back. His limp was visible, a steady, rhythmic beat of sacrifice on the stone pavers. He was still the quiet man in the faded polo shirt, but now, everyone saw the invisible uniform he wore, the weight of the medals he did not display. He was vindicated, his honor restored not by his own words, but by the testimony of those who understood its true meaning. He remained humble. He remained silent. He simply left, leaving the shame and the silence to fester in the perfect, manicured world that had rejected him. The black SUV's doors closed with a solid, final thud. The engine started, and it pulled away, disappearing into the night, leaving a vacuum of truth in its wake. The party was over. The engine of the black SUV faded into the distance, taking with it the last vestiges of the evening's manufactured joy. The guests, one by one, made their excuses, their voices hushed and awkward. They couldn't leave fast enough, fleeing the scene of their own petty cruelty, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of their shame. Soon, only the family was left, standing amidst the wreckage of their celebration. The tiki torches hissed, casting long, dancing shadows on the patio. The half-eaten food grew cold. The abandoned glasses of wine and champagne collected condensation. Mark and Robert stood frozen, two statues of broken pride. The silence between them was no longer comfortable or conspiratorial. It was an abyss of accusation. They had been weighed, they had been measured, and they had been found wanting. Finally, Sarah walked over to her husband. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes were clear and steady. She did not yell. She did not scream. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it held the force of a tectonic plate shifting. "Did you ever ask him?" she asked. Mark looked at her, his face a mask of confusion. "Ask him what?" "Anything," she said, her voice breaking with a sob she could no longer contain. "Did you ever once, in 20 years, ask him about his life? About his time in the service? Did you ever ask him where he got that scar? Did you ever ask him why he limps? Did you ever look at him, your own father, and see anything other than your own disappointment?" Each question was a hammer blow to Mark's shattered ego. He had no answer, because the answer was no. He had never asked. He had never wanted to know. He had been so consumed with building his own future that he had willfully and arrogantly erased his own past, and the man who embodied it. The narrative of the evening serves as a powerful modern-day fable. It reflects on a truth we too often forget, that honor is not loud. True courage does not boast. Real strength is found not in aggression, but in quiet endurance. Heroes walk among us every day, disguised as janitors, as clerks, as quiet old men in faded shirts. They ask for nothing. They seek no recognition. Their reward was in the deed itself, in the promise they kept to their comrades and their country. This 4th of July for this family became a day of reckoning. It was no longer about celebrating an abstract idea of freedom with steak and fireworks. It became a stark, painful reminder of the real human cost of that freedom. It was a lesson learned too late, a moment of clarity that came only after the hero had already turned and walked away, leaving them to contemplate the vast, empty space where a father's love used to be. And so we are left with a question, a reflection for all of us. What does true honor look like to you? Have you ever misjudged someone based on their appearance, only to learn the incredible story they held inside? Tell us your story in the comments below. We read every one. For more stories that inspire us to look deeper, to see the hero in the humble, and to remember the quiet sacrifices that built our world, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell. You never know who you might be sitting next to, and what legendary battles they have fought in the silence.